Hope you're all having a great day so far. Can you believe it's already the last day of March? I can't believe this year has flown by so fast. So, welcome to my 13th episode of Season 2. Today is Wednesday, March 31st, 2021. My name is Sonal Patel, and this is the Paint the Medical Picture podcast series. Now, are you looking for more of my compliance tips for all those SMRC audits that are rolling out? Well, look no more. I dive into it in this episode. And I also discuss the month of March's OIG criminal and civil enforcement cases involving fraud, waste, and abuse. And I also share some inspirational words from our former First Lady, Michelle Obama. If you've checked me out on LinkedIn, you know I'm all about compliance and protecting our physicians and valued healthcare professionals when it comes to the business of medicine. I hope this week with me brings you enough to take back to your organizations, to want to dive in deeper, to use my tips and best practices to ensure success. I hope this podcast will help you boost the quality of documentation capture and improve coding accuracy as you help your providers paint the medical picture. If you like what you're hearing, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss another episode. Please write in a review and 5-star rating on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen to my podcast. I'd really love your support. Now, a quick disclaimer. Before I get started on this episode, this podcast episode and Nexsen Pruet podcast series do not constitute legal advice, but I am fortunate to work with sound healthcare attorneys at Nexsen Pruet. And as their consultant, I have over 10 years of experience in front office, back end, coding, and billing for multi-specialty physicians, compliance, and auditing for both E&M and surgical operative reports. Again, the opinions and insights throughout are mine alone, and they in no means constitute legal advice. So, let's get into Newsworthy, the month's fraud, waste, and abuse cases. The month of March saw 38 cases as of the recording of this episode. Early March saw a lawsuit against an orthodontist for allegedly submitting millions of dollars in false claims to a state's Medicaid program, including by keeping children in braces for longer than medically necessary, as well as the allegedly deceptive billing practices for mouth guards. There were also the many usual suspects, like illegal distribution of opioids with pill mill doctors. There were also kickbacks, bribery schemes, and money laundering galore. There was a medical device manufacturer that will pay over $8 million for misrepresentation and failure to include serious risks in instructions and marketing materials for surgical mesh devices. Of course, False Claims Act allegations were abundant and ranged from family practice to cardiology specialists' practices. But I'd like to highlight two cases that I find most interesting. First, this case involves 13 defendants indicted in an over $5 million healthcare fraud conspiracy to defraud the Medicaid program. The alleged scheme involved mental health practitioners and interpreters who were associated with a patient services company with multiple office locations and counseling clinics. As part of the scheme, the health practitioners and interpreters would allegedly submit fraudulent claims through their respective employers for services provided to Medicaid recipients. However, in reality, neither the mental health services nor the ancillary interpretation services were actually rendered. Some defendants participated in this scheme for nearly 3 years. As a result of these false and fraudulent claims, the Medicaid program paid the entities a total of more than $5 million. Of course, let's keep in mind, though, an indictment is merely an allegation, and all defendants, all 13 here, are presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. Now, the second case also involves mental health services. Here, a mental health counselor allegedly submitted over 2,000 materially false and fraudulent claims to Medicaid and Medicare. Between January 2014 and July 2018, the counselor submitted over 2,000 materially false and fraudulent claims to Medicaid and Medicare. These claims were fraudulent because the counselor had not actually provided services to the patients identified in the claims. Medicaid and Medicare processed these false claims and paid the counselor for services never provided. Further details showcase that this caused a loss of over $145,000 to the Medicaid program, as well as over $40,000 to the Medicare program. This investigation was a collaborative effort between the FBI, the State Medicaid Fraud Control Unit, or the MFUCU, the OIG, as well as HHS. Now, the FBI agent on the case has stated, quote, "This sentence should put others on notice that exploiting federally funded healthcare programs will not be tolerated, and those who engage in this type of crime will be identified and held accountable," end quote. The agent does go on further and states, quote, "We will continue to work with our partners to protect taxpayers' resources from those who would take advantage of such programs for their own greed," end quote. Now, the two showcase pieces this month underscore, in my mind, the many mental health counseling services that simply get processed and paid by CMS. So I always believe these types of fraud, waste, and abuse cases are most helpful. Take a deeper look into these reports and see how they may affect you, your provider, your facility. Start self-auditing your service claims and coordinating documentation to ensure you are meeting compliance. And now, it's time for my best practice tips in Trusty Tip. Let's dive into my compliance tips here in part 4 of my SMRC audits that are blasting in. Remember, these are the 16 new Unified Program Integrity Contractor, or the UPIC audits, that are being conducted via the Supplemental Medical Review Contractor, the SMRC, at Noridian. Their function is to conduct nationwide medical reviews of Parts A, B, and DME providers and suppliers as directed by CMS. It's the responsibility of the SMRC to review medical records and related documentation to ensure that claims are processed in accordance with CMS guidelines. Now, I provided you with the details for 3 in prior episodes that involves durable medical equipment, or DME supplies, in non-covered skilled nursing facilities, also called SNFs, spinal cord stimulators, and outpatient hyperbaric oxygen therapy, or HBOT, that are in the spotlight. So let's get into part 4 of SMRC audits. The fourth is titled 01-021 Diabetic Test Strips, or DTS, and No Response Providers Notification of Medical Review. Now, Noridian SMRC is conducting post-payment review of claims for Medicare Part B DME claims billed on dates of service from January 1st, 2019 through June 30th, 2019. Remember, these are the time parameters. Huge compliance tip here. It is the supplier's responsibility to obtain the ordering practitioner as much documentation from the patient's medical record as necessary to be sure that coverage criteria for an item is met. Now, if the practitioner does not send the requested documentation to the supplier may not receive payment from Medicare for provided items. And failure to supply medical records upon request may reflect Medicare vulnerability. Again, that's an added compliance risk. Now, if a practitioner doesn't respond to a supplier's request for documentation to support the supplies billed, CMS is still continued and concerned that the practitioner may also have other services that are not supported by documentation, right? So be mindful. CMS is now also auditing those providers' claims as well for evaluation and management services too. Now, this notification includes the reasons for the review. Documentation will be requested in the additional documentation request letter or the ADR letter, and resources that providers or suppliers may wish to consult with as they're submitting claims. Now, some background on the why. Why on earth is this audit happening? Now, over the years, the Office of Inspector General, or the OIG, has found that an area vulnerable to fraud, waste, and abuse is in the ordering and dispensing of diabetic test strips, that DTS. Now, there's a report that's dated back to August 2013 that's titled Inappropriate and Questionable Medicare Billing for Diabetes Test Strips that supports these findings. Now, the previous SMRC back in 2015 and 2016 performed a diabetic test strip, a DTS, medical review project, and the findings also, again, supported that additional review and education on the DTS benefit for Medicare was still needed. So, we've all been well aware now, apparently, right, since 2013, that there have been issues at large with the OIG based on these prior year's findings reports, right? So, it's 2021. We still have issues. So, let's go over some basic facts as well. Now, a diabetic beneficiary uses a glucose meter to test the level of glucose in their blood. The meter uses the DTS to perform these readings. Medicare covers up to 100 DTS, or diabetic test strips, every 3 months for a non-insulin dependent beneficiary. Medicare also covers up to 100 DTS per month, or up to 300 DTS every 3 months for the insulin dependent beneficiary. Any Medicare coverage for the DTS over these specified limits needs to meet coverage criteria for medically necessary and needs the required supporting documentation found in the physician or practitioner's records. Now, the supplier is responsible to obtain from the physician or practitioner the supporting documentation from the beneficiary's medical record to ensure that coverage criteria has been met. Now, if the supplier is unable to receive those records and supporting documentation upon request, this is what causes a hardship on the supplier, as this creates an inability to collect the proper Medicare reimbursement. So, of course, the reason for the review is critical. Now, the SMRC is narrowing it down in scope for us. Thank goodness. The scope involves Noridian performing data analysis and conducting medical review. Noridian will complete their data analysis and review activities in accordance with applicable statutory, regulatory, and sub-regulatory guidance. They are honing in on HCPCS codes A4253, which is defined as blood glucose test or reagent strips for home blood glucose monitor per 50 strips. They're also honing in on HCPCS code A4259, which is defined as lancets per box of 100. Now, of course, there are also documentation requirements that are needed as well. So I'm going to go over a list of 7 specific, very specific documentation requirements that will also be listed out in your ADR letter. These are items that you'll have to furnish to support your claims that have already been paid and are now under post-payment review. Now, the first item is for written, verbal, and dispensing order. The second is for your detailed written order, or your DWO. The third is for all pertinent medical record documentation for diabetic test strips and lancets, including, but not limited to, the diagnosis, as well as the treatment regimen. The fourth is for documentation to support coverage for quantities of diabetic test strips and lancets that exceed the usual utilization, which are including, but not limited to, provider's notes, as well as testing logs or other documentation that supports the frequency of blood glucose testing to support the utilization greater than policy limits. Now, the fifth is for those refill requests for diabetic test strips and lancets provided on a recurring basis to validate the quantity of diabetic test strips on hand have been clearly exhausted. And the sixth is, of course, you need to be providing your patients with that advanced beneficiary notice, those ABNs, if they're applicable. And the last item, the seventh, is for any and all other documentation to support the items billed. Now, remember, these post-payment audits are a sign, a signal that something may be amiss in your documentation, your coding, and your billing. These 7 requirements are a very good reminder that you should be improving workflows and efficiencies at your practice to ensure that all documentation is being captured and provided. So, a better, smarter approach is one that's proactive and starts by painting a clear, rich, and vibrant medical picture the first time, so your certified medical coder can then abstract codes with accuracy. And finally, in this week's inspiring quote in Spark is from our former First Lady, Michelle Obama. The only limit to the height of your achievements is the reach of your dreams and your willingness to work for them. Precisely so, right? I find this statement to echo the idea of greatness knows no limitations. This statement echoes the idea that our dreams have no ceiling, no boundaries. It is only through hard work and persistence that we can achieve any type, any form of greatness that we seek. I am happy Michelle Obama's spark still shines on in all of us today. So that wraps up today's episode. Please go out and do great things this week. Aim a little higher, do a little more, and give back in any way you can in 2021. There's so much each one of us can do. Remember to keep masking up, washing up, and staying physically distant. We're not all vaccinated just yet. So, as always, I appreciate you diving into today with me. And if you would like to inquire about my consultant services, you can always reach me through my email address at nexsenpruet.com. I'll leave links to everything in the show notes below. Please continue staying safe and healthy, practice safety for one and all during our collective life in the time of coronavirus. Thank you for listening in on today's episode, and I hope every week with me brings you closer to helping your providers paint a masterpiece. See you next Wednesday.